It started with a scream. Not just any scream, but the raw, panicked shout of my cousin Emma from the backyard, her voice slicing through the lazy afternoon like a siren. I sprinted outside, my heart in my throat, to find my great-uncle Walter collapsed under the shade tree, face pale, lips trembling. Instinct took over. I yelled for someone to call an ambulance, grabbed my keys, and bolted for the emergency exit driveway we had installed specifically for situations like this. Except when I rounded the corner, I froze. There, arrogantly sprawled across the entire exit, was Karen's monstrous white SUV, its chrome rims glinting like it was mocking me. My hands shook as I pounded on the windows. Nothing. No Karen, no keys, just a smug little HOA meeting in progress flyer taped to the windshield, like that somehow gave her permission to block a literal emergency exit. I backed up, scanned the street for any sign of her, and that's when I saw her standing 2 houses down at her precious little community beautification gathering, sipping lemonade and laughing like a queen surveying her kingdom. Rage boiled up inside me, but there was no time for anger. Walter needed help. The ambulance wouldn't make it up the main road. It was clogged from a street repair detour, and the back exit was the only clear path. We were trapped, every second ticking by felt like it was hammering nails into my chest. I sprinted to my neighbor's door, hammering my fists against it without thinking. It swung open almost immediately to reveal Mr. Gibson, the quiet older gentleman who lived next door. He was normally so soft-spoken that half the street forgot he existed. Not today. His sharp eyes flicked from my face to the blocked exit, instantly taking in everything. Without a word, he reached inside the door, grabbed something, and stepped out. It wasn't until he held it up that I realized what it was, an official badge. Not just any badge, but a judge's badge. State level. His expression was a mixture of stone-cold fury and something that made even me want to step back as he strode down the street toward Karen like a storm in human form. I knew 2 things immediately. First, my family might just make it through this nightmare. Second, Karen had no idea that the worst day of her life was about to begin. Everything after that felt like a hurricane ripping through what had been a picture-perfect Sunday. The paramedics managed to find a gap through the street mess, but it took precious extra minutes, and they had to maneuver around Karen's SUV with surgical precision while Walter's life hung in the balance. I couldn't even bring myself to look Karen in the eye as she finally wandered over, arms crossed, feigning confusion. She had the nerve to say it wasn't a big deal. She said, and I quote, "It's just a parking spot. He can wait a minute." It was a miracle I didn't physically launch myself at her right then. Instead, I watched as Mr. Gibson calmly introduced himself, listed his title, and explained in chillingly polite terms the federal and state laws she had just violated. Karen's smugness faltered for a moment, but she rallied with the classic entitled defense: blame everyone else. She pointed at me, at the paramedics, even at Uncle Walter, claiming that it wasn't her fault because nobody told her the driveway was important. Her voice rose, hysterical, shrill enough to make dogs 3 streets over bark. Even then, she might have slithered away with a slap on the wrist if she had just apologized. But no, Karen doubled down, insisting loudly that as an HOA board member, she had the authority to use any property for community purposes. That was when Judge Gibson made another phone call. I couldn't hear the exact words, but the clipped, official tone he used sent visible shivers down Karen's spine. She started backing away, mumbling about needing to pick up her kids, but it was too late. The damage was done. The paramedics loaded Walter into the ambulance, and my heart broke watching them rush away without me, because there was no room and because precious seconds had already been lost. As the street emptied out and the neighbors who had gathered at the commotion began to drift back to their homes, Karen tried to slink away too. She even had the audacity to glare at me like this was somehow my fault. I didn't move. Neither did Gibson. He stood there, arms folded, watching her with the kind of expression that probably gave attorneys nightmares. He caught my eye and gave a slight nod, a silent reassurance that this was far from over. In the pit of my stomach, I knew the next few days were going to be brutal for Karen. What I didn't know yet was just how completely her entire empire of entitlement was about to come crashing down. not just because of me, but because she had picked the absolute worst possible neighbor to mess with. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the scene in my head. Walter's collapsed body, the blocked driveway, Karen's smirking face. I sat by the window, looking out at the dark street, thinking about how close things had come to going horribly wrong. I thought about what Gibson had said about laws and rights, about the fact that people like Karen could bully their way through neighborhoods for years until they messed with the wrong person. Somewhere deep inside, anger mixed with a strange kind of hope. Maybe, just maybe, something good could come out of this. Maybe Karen wasn't just going to get a ticket or a lecture. Maybe she was about to face something bigger, something that would finally, fully, and publicly hold her accountable. I leaned back in my chair, watching the faint flicker of blue lights from the emergency vehicles still lingering a few streets over, and allowed myself a grim little smile. Tomorrow was a new day, and it was one Karen was never going to forget. Morning broke heavy and gray, like even the sky knew today was going to be a storm. I barely slept, nerves twitching under my skin like live wires. As I pulled open the curtains, I spotted Karen already marching up and down the street like a general inspecting her troops. She carried a clipboard, her cell phone glued to her ear, barking orders to some poor soul on the other end. From the exaggerated way she was waving her arms and glancing toward my house, it was clear I was the villain of her latest story. It didn't take long to find out exactly what she was spinning. An email blast hit every homeowner's inbox by 8:00 a.m., sent from the HOA board under Karen's signature, claiming that there had been an unfortunate misunderstanding involving unauthorized modifications to my driveway, that my family's improperly marked private access had caused a community disruption, and that the HOA was reviewing appropriate sanctions. I stared at the screen in disbelief, my jaw hanging open. It was such a bald-faced lie that it almost felt surreal, like I had slipped into some bad soap opera where the villain twirled her mustache and laughed over paperwork. I wasn't the only one who thought it was absurd. Within minutes, my neighbor Diana texted me screenshots, followed by Mr. Gibson sending a single-line message, "Save all communications." It was both comforting and unsettling at once. He knew this wasn't over. Karen wasn't just digging herself deeper. She was building an entire underground bunker of crazy. By mid-morning, 2 members of the HOA council came knocking at my door. Tyler and Brenda, 2 of Karen's closest allies, stood there trying to look authoritative, clipboards in hand and awkward half-smiles plastered on their faces. Tyler cleared his throat like he was about to deliver a royal proclamation. He informed me that a mandatory compliance review would be conducted regarding my property's alleged violations, and that fines could be assessed pending the outcome. I asked, very calmly, what violations they were referring to. They exchanged a nervous glance before Brenda stumbled out that my emergency driveway had not been approved in writing by the HOA. I nearly laughed. The driveway had been permitted, inspected, and approved by the city years before the HOA even existed in our neighborhood. When I pointed that out, they shifted tactics. Brenda suggested maybe I had repainted the driveway improperly, making it harder to identify as private access. It was laughable. There were 2 giant emergency exit only signs and reflective paint. They were grasping at invisible straws, and badly. I asked if they had brought a written notice or official complaint. They mumbled something about following up by email, and quickly retreated down the steps, glancing around like they expected Gibson to come storming out with a subpoena at any second. And they weren't wrong to be worried. Around noon, a Blacktown car pulled up in front of my house. Out stepped a woman in a dark blue suit carrying a thick manila folder. She introduced herself as Ms. Daniels, an investigator assigned to a judicial ethics task force. Apparently, when Gibson made his calls yesterday, he hadn't been bluffing or even making casual threats. He had filed an official complaint through judicial channels regarding the HOA's obstruction of an emergency route and potential violations of municipal safety code. Daniels explained that when a judge reports something like this, it triggers automatic preliminary investigations, especially if it involves public safety risk. She asked if I would be willing to provide a statement and share any footage I had. I didn't hesitate for a second. I loaded every security clip, every photograph, every email Karen had sent onto a flash drive for her. While Daniels was inside taking my statement, Karen reappeared. She stood across the street, arms folded, glaring daggers at my house like she could set it on fire with sheer rage. Her friends from the HOA council huddled around her, whispering furiously. It was the first time I saw real fear flicker across Karen's face. She could sense control slipping away, but she wasn't smart enough to realize how completely she had already lost it. That afternoon, she hosted what she called an emergency board meeting on her front lawn, setting up folding chairs like it was a barbecue. About 8 loyalists showed up, sipping sodas and fanning themselves, trying to look serious while Karen ranted. From my porch, I could hear snatches of her speech. She blamed everything on me, on the judge next door, on unfair persecution, even on the toxic culture of personal attacks against hard-working HOA volunteers. It was a spectacle. I half expected her to start handing out pitchforks and torches. Then things took a turn from ridiculous to insane. Karen announced to her little gathering that she was filing a counter-complaint against me for reckless endangerment of the community by spreading false panic about an emergency. It was so backward that for a second, I genuinely wondered if I had hallucinated it. But no, she had the audacity to blame me for the chaos she caused by blocking the exit. The handful of neighbors who had been curious enough to gather around looked horrified. Some of them started backing away, realizing the sheer level of delusion they were witnessing. Karen mistook their horror for support and barreled forward, promising to take this all the way to the mayor if necessary. It was the kind of blind confidence only the truly oblivious could muster. As evening approached, there was a strange, tense quiet across the neighborhood. People were whispering, watching from behind curtains. Karen's little crew disbanded one by one, their faith crumbling faster than her legal standing. I sat on my porch with a cold drink, watching the last rays of sun dip behind the houses when Mr. Gibson came over. He didn't say much. He didn't have to. He just handed me a single sheet of paper, neatly folded, and gave a small nod. I unfolded it and felt a jolt shoot through me. It was an official letter from the county clerk's office, notifying Karen and the HOA board that they were being subpoenaed for an administrative hearing regarding code violations, endangerment, and abuse of community authority. Hearing date, next week. I looked up to thank him, but Gibson was already walking back toward his house, calm and silent as always. Meanwhile, across the street, Karen stood frozen on her porch, reading a similar letter she must have just received. Her mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear, but her expression said it all. Panic, fear, confusion. She had thought this was just another little HOA squabble she could bully her way through. She had no idea that she had triggered a legal avalanche, and now it was coming straight for her, faster than she could run. The sun was just rising the next morning when the neighborhood buzz started again. But this time it wasn't chatter. It was the sharp, unmistakable sounds of heavy tires and official boots hitting the pavement. 2 county vehicles rolled into the street, parking right in front of Karen's house. Men and women in uniform, wearing badges that gleamed under the early light, stepped out carrying clipboards and cameras. They moved efficiently, ignoring Karen, who came sprinting out of her front door, waving her arms frantically. She shouted about harassment, about privacy rights, about how this was all a giant mistake, but they didn't even flinch. They had orders and a list of violations to investigate, and Karen's tantrum was nothing more than background noise to them. By mid-morning, Karen's SUV was the centerpiece of a full photographic investigation. Tape measures stretched across the emergency exit. Officials took photos from every angle. Neighbors peered through windows or conveniently found reasons to walk their dogs past the scene. Karen paced back and forth like a caged animal, alternately sobbing into her phone and shouting at the investigators. Her friends from the HOA board were nowhere to be seen. Not Tyler, not Brenda, not any of the people who had smiled and nodded when she was spouting nonsense about my driveway being illegal. She was alone now, and the realization was visibly crushing her. Just when it seemed it couldn't get worse for her, a deputy posted an official notice right on her front door. In bright red letters, It warned that further obstruction of emergency access would not only result in fines but could lead to immediate criminal charges under the state's public endangerment statute. Karen ripped the notice down with shaking hands and screamed so loud I could hear it from my porch. She threw the paper into her yard and stomped on it like a furious toddler. I couldn't help but feel a flicker of satisfaction, but there was also a deeper, colder feeling beneath it. This wasn't over. Not yet. Word spread like wildfire. The official city website updated that afternoon to reflect a pending administrative hearing for serious violations of public safety regulations connected to the HOA's activities. Karen's name wasn't the only one listed. Every officer on the board was summoned too. That sent a fresh wave of panic through the neighborhood. Some board members showed up at Karen's house late that evening, trying to hold a private emergency meeting. It quickly turned into a shouting match, loud enough that several neighbors called the non-emergency police line to report a disturbance. Patrol cars showed up within minutes, breaking up the argument before it spilled onto the lawn. Watching them all scatter into the night was like watching rats fleeing a sinking ship. Meanwhile, Gibson moved quietly behind the scenes. He compiled city ordinances, state laws, even HOA charter clauses that Karen had violated. He wasn't just planning to defend the neighborhood from her insanity. He was preparing to dismantle the entire corrupt operation she had built. Late that night, he sat at my kitchen table, sipping coffee as we went over the emergency exit documents. Every permit, every inspection, every sign authorization was meticulously filed and time-stamped. Karen couldn't touch it. She had no legal ground to stand on. Gibson smiled a small, grim smile that made me realize just how dangerous he could be when properly motivated. He wasn't just protecting me, he was protecting every future family who might one day rely on that exit in a real emergency. When the official subpoenas were delivered the next morning, it felt like the final nail in the coffin. Karen stood frozen in her doorway as the process server handed her the papers. No theatrics now, no shouting, no bravado, just a stunned silence, like the realization had finally punched through her wall of denial. She sat down on her porch steps, staring at the documents as if they might rewrite themselves if she just wished hard enough. But there was no escape. She was facing personal liability. She was facing HOA charter violations. And she was facing very public humiliation. It was later that same day when something unexpected happened. Brenda, one of Karen's most loyal allies, knocked on my door. She looked exhausted, wringing her hands like a woman confessing to a crime. She apologized. She actually apologized. She admitted that Karen had pressured and bullied the board into backing her schemes for years, threatening fines, blacklisting members, even making up fake rule violations against anyone who crossed her. Brenda explained that the HOA's original documents had clear protections for emergency access, but Karen had simply decided those didn't apply to her. Hearing it laid out like that, hearing the fear and regret in Brenda's voice, made me realize just how deep Karen's rot had gone. Brenda begged me to share the documentation Gibson had compiled with other neighbors. She said many people didn't even know they had the right to resist the HOA's bullying. She offered to testify if necessary, willing to stand up in the hearing and tell the truth. I agreed. It was bigger than me now. It was about making sure this never happened to anyone else. Preparations for the hearing moved quickly. Gibson coordinated quietly with city attorneys and administrative officials. He made sure every duck was in a row, every violation catalogued, every witness ready. He even arranged for a paramedic from the ambulance that struggled to reach Walter that day to testify about the danger of a blocked exit. It wasn't just about catching Karen in a lie. It was about proving beyond any doubt that what she had done had real consequences, that her ego had endangered lives. As the hearing day approached, you could feel the tension tightening over the neighborhood like a rope. Karen still tried to play queen bee, but her little kingdom had crumbled. No one returned her calls. Her friends avoided her. Flyers for her so-called community improvement projects were torn down within hours of being posted. She had become a pariah overnight. Yet in classic Karen fashion, she still clung to the delusion that she could win, that she could talk her way out of it, that somehow if she just yelled loud enough, everyone would forget what she had done. The night before the hearing, I found myself standing at the emergency exit, the sight of it all. The driveway was quiet under the street lights, the reflective emergency signs shining clean and clear. For the first time in days, I let myself breathe easy. Tomorrow it would all come out. Tomorrow the lies would be laid bare. Tomorrow Karen would finally face something she could not argue, bully, or charm her way through. Justice was coming, and it was coming fast. The morning of the hearing felt like the entire neighborhood was holding its breath. Even the birds seemed quieter, the usual early chatter replaced by a tense, eerie silence. I left the house early, papers neatly stacked in my folder, but even without looking, I could feel the eyes of the neighbors watching from behind curtains and half-cracked doors. Everyone knew today was going to decide not just Karen's fate, but the future of the entire HOA that had ruled over them for far too long. At the community center, the hearing room was already buzzing. Rows of chairs were filled with homeowners, some leaning forward eagerly, others nervously shifting in their seats. At the front of the room, a long table was set for the administrative judge and the city officials overseeing the proceedings. The air was thick with anticipation, a mixture of excitement and dread. Karen arrived fashionably late, making a grand entrance like she was attending a gala instead of a public hearing. She wore an expensive-looking suit and carried herself with the same smug superiority that had gotten her into this mess. But the cracks were already showing. Her hair was frazzled at the edges, her makeup a bit too heavy, her smile just a little too forced. Following behind her were Tyler and a few other former board members, looking like they'd rather be anywhere else on earth. Karen marched up to the defendant's table, plopping down a massive binder with an exaggerated thud that echoed across the room. It was pure theater, but nobody looked impressed. The administrative judge, a stern woman with sharp glasses and a no-nonsense voice, called the room to order. She outlined the charges clearly: obstruction of an emergency exit, violation of state safety codes, abuse of authority as HOA officers, and reckless endangerment. Karen, speaking for herself and the board, immediately jumped to her feet and launched into a rambling monologue about community spirit, her years of unpaid service, and how she had only ever acted in the neighborhood's best interests. She portrayed herself as a martyr, a misunderstood hero unfairly targeted by a vindictive few. She gestured wildly at the crowd as if expecting applause. Instead, the room stayed stone silent, the weight of truth hanging in the air. When it came time for evidence, the city's attorney moved swiftly. Photographs of the blocked emergency exit were shown on a large screen, each one more damning than the last. Security footage captured the SUV parked illegally for hours during the emergency, Karen ignoring flashing lights, ignoring shouts for help. Official permits for the emergency driveway were presented, ironclad and irrefutable. A paramedic testified next, describing the delay caused by the blockage and how precious minutes were lost trying to navigate around it. Every word was another nail in Karen's coffin, and the audience could feel it. Her face paled visibly, her earlier bravado wilting under the unrelenting wave of facts. When it was my turn, I stepped up to the microphone and told the story as plainly and calmly as I could. I didn't embellish or rant. I didn't need to. The truth was enough. I described finding Walter collapsed, running to the emergency exit, realizing it was blocked, and the helpless horror of those critical moments ticking away. I kept my voice steady even when emotion clawed at my throat. The administrative judge nodded thoughtfully, her pen scratching notes across her legal pad. When I finished, there was a pause, a heavy silence that seemed to press down on everyone in the room. Karen's response was nothing short of disastrous. She stood, wagging her finger furiously, accusing me of exaggeration, of staging the entire incident to sabotage her leadership. She claimed I had orchestrated Walter's collapse for sympathy points, a statement so outrageous that gasps rippled through the room. Even the judge's eyebrows shot up in disbelief. Karen realized her mistake too late. She stammered, trying to backtrack, but the damage was already done. Any shred of credibility she might have clung to was obliterated in that instant. Brenda, who had once been one of Karen's closest allies, followed me to the stand. Her testimony was devastating. Calmly and clearly, she laid out Karen's history of bullying the board, of ignoring safety warnings, of dismissing legal advice when it suited her. She admitted the board had allowed it for too long out of fear and misplaced loyalty. When she finished, several homeowners actually clapped softly before catching themselves. The judge didn't scold them. She simply allowed it to pass, a silent acknowledgement that the truth had finally been spoken aloud. By the time closing statements arrived, Karen was a shadow of the person who had strutted into the room that morning. Her speech was a rambling, incoherent mess of contradictions and self-pity. She cried at one point, dabbing her eyes with an embroidered handkerchief, but no one in the room seemed moved. The city's attorney, in contrast, gave a precise and brutal summary, laying out every violation in cold, logical order. When the judge finally called for a recess to deliberate, the room exhaled collectively, like a pressure valve being released after days of unbearable tension. The wait wasn't long. 15 minutes later, everyone was called back in. The administrative judge wasted no time. She found Karen and the implicated board members guilty on all charges. The HOA's authority was suspended pending a full reorganization supervised by the city. Karen was fined personally for the maximum amount allowable under municipal code. She was barred from holding any HOA position indefinitely. Worse for her, the judge referred the case to the district attorney for potential criminal charges regarding obstruction of emergency services. A rare but serious step that caused another murmur to roll through the crowd. Karen stood frozen, eyes wide, mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. It was over, truly over, not with a bang or a final shouted argument, but with a cold, decisive series of sentences that stripped away every ounce of the power she had clung to for years. As the room emptied, people lingered outside in small groups, talking animatedly, a sense of relief and cautious hope in the air. No one approached Karen. She sat alone on the courthouse steps, clutching her ruined binder, staring blankly at the ground as if trying to comprehend how everything had slipped through her fingers so completely. I drove home with the windows down, the breeze cool against my face. It felt like the end of a nightmare, but more than that, it felt like a beginning, a chance to rebuild, to create a community that actually cared about safety, fairness, and respect. As I pulled into my driveway, I saw Gibson standing on his porch, watching. He raised his coffee cup in a small, victorious salute. I returned the gesture, a silent thank you between neighbors who had stood against the storm and refused to be pushed down. In the distance, the emergency exit glinted in the fading afternoon sun, clear and unobstructed, a symbol of a neighborhood finally free. In the days that followed the hearing, it felt like the entire neighborhood had woken up from a bad dream. The tension that had gripped the streets for years seemed to dissolve almost overnight, replaced by a sense of cautious optimism. For the first time in a long while, people lingered outside their homes to chat. Children rode their bikes without glares from passing HOA officers, and neighbors who once kept their heads down now waved freely at one another. The power Karen had wielded through fear and manipulation was shattered, and the community was eager to rebuild something better from the wreckage she left behind. The city quickly moved in to reorganize the HOA, appointing an interim trustee to manage essential services and oversee the election of a new board. There was talk of dissolving the HOA altogether, but most agreed that what we needed wasn't the absence of rules. It was leadership that actually protected residents instead of terrorizing them. Flyers went out inviting everyone to a special town hall meeting, this time not in a stuffy boardroom controlled by Karen's clique, but at the community park under the open sky, where anyone could speak. On the day of the town hall, the turnout was massive. Families brought picnic blankets and lawn chairs, kids played nearby, and volunteers set up tables with lemonade and cookies. It didn't look like a political meeting. It looked like a community gathering, the way it should have been all along. I found a spot near the front with Gibson, who sat quietly sipping his coffee as always, his presence a silent but powerful reminder of how we got here. The interim trustee welcomed everyone and opened the floor for nominations for the new HOA board. For a moment, there was a nervous hush, but then hands shot up, names were called out, and for the first time, people who genuinely cared about the neighborhood stepped forward. No backroom deals, no whispered threats, just open nominations and honest speeches. When it came time to vote, it was almost a formality. Diana, the neighbor who had sent me the screenshots of Karen's emails that started unraveling her lies, was elected president by a landslide. 2 younger parents with kids were voted onto the board, along with a retired firefighter who promised to prioritize safety over politics. It was a clean sweep, a complete turnover from the old regime. As the meeting wrapped up and the sun began to set, Diana took the microphone one last time to make a special announcement. She thanked the residents for their courage, for standing up, and then called me to the front. I tried to decline, but the crowd wouldn't have it. I stood awkwardly while Diana and the new board presented me with a small plaque that read, "For outstanding service to our community." It was simple but heartfelt, and it meant more to me than I could put into words. Afterward, Gibson clapped me on the shoulder and handed me a folded piece of paper. I opened it to find a hand-drawn map of the emergency exit and a small note that simply said, "Guard what matters." It was his way of saying congratulations, but also a reminder that vigilance was the price of keeping what we fought for. As the crowd began to disperse, a few of the neighbors approached me to talk, to share their stories about Karen's bullying tactics, about the fines and threats they had endured. It was heartbreaking to hear, but it also felt healing. We weren't just individuals anymore. We were a neighborhood again. Meanwhile, Karen's fall from grace was swift and brutal. Word spread that she had listed her house for sale within a week of the hearing. No one really knew if she was leaving voluntarily or under pressure from pending legal action, but nobody seemed particularly sad to see the moving trucks arrive. On the morning she left, a few of us watched from our porches as she loaded the last of her furniture into a battered rental truck. She didn't look at anyone. She kept her head down, avoiding eye contact, her former arrogance replaced by a hollow, defeated posture. It was a quiet, pitiful end to the reign of a woman who had once treated the neighborhood like her personal fiefdom. With Karen gone, small improvements started popping up everywhere. The park got cleaned up. The community garden, which Karen had once tried to shut down for unauthorized vegetable growing, flourished with new volunteers. Emergency exits, including mine, were freshly marked and fitted with better signage. The new board even organized a block party to celebrate the neighborhood's new beginning. It was simple but joyful, filled with laughter and music, and for once, there were no fines, no inspections, no harassment, just neighbors enjoying being neighbors. One evening a few weeks later, I found myself standing by the emergency exit again, looking at the spot where everything had nearly gone so wrong. Someone had placed a new sign there, sturdier and larger than the old one. It read, "Community safety first, emergency access only." It was a small thing, but to me, it felt monumental. It represented everything we had fought for, everything we had reclaimed. As I stood there watching the sunset cast golden light across the sign, Gibson joined me. He didn't say anything, just nodded once, a simple gesture filled with meaning. We had come through the fire and emerged stronger. A few days later, a package arrived at my door. It was from Walter's family. Inside was a beautifully carved wooden plaque with the words, "Thank you for saving lives," etched into it. Beneath that, a smaller line. A community's heartbeat is strongest when its people stand together. I hung it in my living room where everyone who visited could see it. Every time I looked at it, it reminded me that standing up, even when it's hard, even when it feels like you're the only one shouting into the wind, matters. Changes things, saves things. As summer turned to fall, life settled into a peaceful rhythm. New families moved into the neighborhood. Old residents came out of their shells, and a genuine sense of trust blossomed where suspicion and fear had once ruled. It wasn't perfect, of course. No community ever is. But it was ours again, and if Karen or anyone like her ever tried to tear it down, they would find a neighborhood ready to stand together, stronger than ever, unwilling to ever let fear and arrogance dictate their lives again. We had learned our lesson the hard way, but we had learned it well. Some battles you don't choose, but when they come, you fight, not just for yourself, but for everyone around you. And when you win, the victory tastes sweeter than anything you could have imagined.